Wes Craven, the master of horror. There are few genre directors that are as beloved as him, as analyzed and as deeply discussed, with good reason. Wes Craven changed the face of horror, and he did so by going deep into the psyche of the audience, unearthing the darkest of nightmares. Wes Craven's childhood was restrictive, with the young Craven not being allowed to watch movies, which of course fed his desire to work in cinema. He began by working on X-rated material using pseudonyms, but the young Craven had loftier goals. He admired Ingmar Bergman's The Virgin Spring, and when time came to make his first film, he chose to do an unofficial horror remake. The result was The Last House on the Left. The Last House on the Left follows a young woman living an ordinary American life, unsuspecting and safe. She's just another young adult growing up in post-World War II America, where the threats were limited to the other of communism and foreign agents as represented in 50s science fiction. But that world had already died in the early 1960s. The curtain had been pulled back through an Asian land war America was bound to lose.
We did not lose Vietnam. It was a tie.
Through murders in the heart of Hollywood targeting the innocent stars of tomorrow, and through the awful specter of slavery and discrimination haunting American society. Indeed, the values of America were an illusion seen on television and in sci-fi adventures at the weekly matinee. And the truth that America was a brutal place was coming out not just through social turmoil, but also through art. Key among these new works of art was The Last House on the Left.
Hey, what's new in the outside world?
Same old stuff. Murder and mayhem.
It features the breaking down of the American family, when the rape and murder of a young woman drive her parents to bloody vengeance. With this story, Wes Craven had hit a nerve. And it was a nerve that he was willing to touch again and again throughout his career. But it started at The Last House on the Left. No wonder Craven remembered the film so fondly. I met him once, and in my conversation with him, this and A Nightmare on Elm Street were the two films he highlighted from his career. These two were the ones he truly wanted to talk about. And they are the most analyzed ones by critics and film historians, so of course we will look at them. But Craven's career was more complex, with triumph and failure, so I hope to find something more to say about him, something outside of that theme of the breakdown of the family unit, because Wes Craven was an interesting and multifaceted artist. There is so much to focus on, so much to mention. Where then do I begin? Back in 2013, I was invited to a Hollywood Hills party with a killer view. This particular view, in fact, the very same house used as a location in an episode of Lucifer. I was a young screenwriter, working my second gig ever. As the sun set, an erudite and quiet gentleman came up next to me. I did a double take and asked if he was Wes Craven. "I am," he answered, and he was more than willing to chat, as was his lovely wife Iya. Wes Craven smiled when I quipped that I grew up on Elm Street and that his movies meant a lot to me. We talked movies for nearly an hour, and I was getting worried I was intruding on his night. I was told, nonsense. So, after a long and detailed conversation about cinema, and particularly about his own cinema, isn't it weird that I can't figure out exactly what I want to say about Wes Craven? What, more than anything else, do I want to highlight about him? What do I want to focus on? There are too many thematic elements to choose from, too rich a filmography to narrow it down to a 28-minute long video essay. I suppose going through his works chronologically is the best way forward. After the indie success of The Last House on the Left, Craven followed it up with The Hills Have Eyes. The story follows a family traveling through the Nevada desert, where they become stranded near old nuclear testing grounds. The nightmare that follows sees the family ravaged by another sort of family, a clan of cannibals, a metaphor exposing the grotesque side of American history. It is no surprise then that The Hills Have Eyes is set in Nevada, the US state with the most nuclear test explosions. After President Harry Truman established the Nevada nuclear test site in 1950, over 900 nuclear explosions have polluted the Nevada landscape, sometimes with human test subjects in trenches, and sometimes with tourists watching the blasts from nearby Las Vegas. The Hills Have Eyes plays on this American legacy, the legacy of a terrible weapon that can wipe out all life on our planet. And it uses this threat as a representation of how American life is torn apart by violence.
We're not on a bomb range, and we're not goddamn lost, and we are not...
The narrative of The Hills Have Eyes was directly inspired by the Scottish legend of Sone Bean, in which a clan of Scotsmen preyed upon travelers, murdering and eating them. But make no mistake, The Hills Have Eyes is all about corrupted Americana. The desert landscapes traversed by that most American invention of the mobile home is a representation of American mythology. People traveled by wagon train in the mythic origins of the country, and this motif is recreated here. With his first two films, Wes Craven had thus established himself as a talented filmmaker creating works of surface-level crudity, yet this crudity reflected the darkness and the depth of the American nightmare. At the start of the 80s, Craven came out with two films, Deadly Blessing, about oppression and dreams in a rural community, and Swamp Thing, a somewhat forgotten horror take on the DC Vertigo comic character. Deadly Blessing marks a shift in Craven's career, moving away from his stark, low-budget efforts of the 1970s, instead steering towards more polished, intellectualized horror. Following a woman haunted by disturbing dreams and visions, Deadly Blessing signals Craven's fascination with nightmares. And while this film is today mostly forgotten, it is fascinating for Craven aficionados, serving as a precursor for what was to come. Swamp Thing was as much a comic book film as it was a horror tale. The film again features another sort of Americana, one quite different from the corrupted suburbia of The Last House on the Left and the sprawl of the American nuclear desert in The Hills Have Eyes. The swamplands of the southern United States are iconic, but far less studied cinematically, probably because filming in swampland is exceedingly difficult. Swamp Thing as a film was an attempt at a more commercial Hollywood-style filmmaking. This, mixed with a comic book narrative of a man turned into a monster, in my opinion makes the film less effective. It feels somewhat split, somewhat less focused, though Craven does explore themes of the corruption of Americana and the destruction of the family unit. If Swamp Thing was less thematically successful than the usual Craven film, he certainly did an about-face in 1984. This was the year that Craven's reputation as a master of horror was forever solidified. A Nightmare on Elm Street is perhaps the most iconic horror film of the 80s era. The decently well-reviewed film became a cultural phenomenon. Some critics hailed it as a well-made addition to a so-called overworked genre. A backhanded compliment if you ask me. But audiences knew they'd found something special. The monster, Freddy Krueger, haunts the dreams of several teenagers. If they die in their dreams, they die in real life. A Nightmare on Elm Street is an exceptional horror film. Inventive, thematically resonant, scary, wry, and iconic. It launched a franchise, and with it secured the future of a tiny low-budget studio called New Line Cinema. New Line is for good reason called the house that Freddy built. Imagine if there had been no Elm Street. then there would also have been no Lord of the Rings, no Austin Powers, no Final Destination. At least not as we know them today. Several Elm Street sequels were produced, and their history is covered in the 4-hour documentary Never Sleep Again, The Elm Street Legacy. Hands down one of the best documentaries on cinema I've ever seen. The 4-hour runtime flies by before you know it. In the documentary, Wes Craven tells us he's not entirely happy with the direction taken in the Elm Street sequels. He expressed the same sentiment to me when we talked, though perhaps a little more brusquely.
Yeah, Freddy Krueger.
Freddy, that's right. I like that movie. It was scary.
Well, the first one was, but the rest sucked.
I asked about the excellent third film in the series, which he'd co-written, but he didn't seem particularly fond of it. Strangely, the 1994 metatextual sequel that he himself directed, Wes Craven's New Nightmare, where Freddy Krueger comes to life in the real world, and where Wes Craven plays himself, that one never even came up in our conversation. Now, the Elm Street series is something special, something deserving of a 4-hour documentary, so I'm not going to delve too deep into this series. Instead, frankly, you should watch the documentary Never Sleep Again. The level of depth and analysis by writer Tommy Hudson and directors Daniel Farrands and Andrew Cash is astounding. And that 4-hour runtime is needed to cover all that must be said about Freddy Krueger and company. After A Nightmare on Elm Street, The Hills Have Eyes Part 2 and Deadly Friend followed. Neither were particularly successful, certainly not compared to the first Elm Street film, now already a massive horror franchise. But Deadly Friend is definitely worth a look. It is a sci-fi horror hybrid with a story that concerns a robot. After it is destroyed, the robot manages to possess a brain-dead girl, taking control of her body. Deadly Friend may not be a classic, but it's probably the most meme-worthy of all Wes Craven films. After these two less-known efforts, Craven steered in a new direction, one that suited his talent for coming up with innovative new takes on horror tropes. But this time, he left the Americana behind, instead delving into Haitian lore. The Serpent and the Rainbow came out in 1988. It is a moody zombie thriller, one with ties to classic Hollywood lore. In the first 3.5 decades of zombie cinema, filmmakers kept true to the origin of the zombie mythos, which of course was the voodoo culture of Haiti. It was a culture steeped in the tradition of a people who'd been brought to the New World against their will, serving as slaves to white masters. However, when George A. Romero directed Night of the Living Dead in 1968, the zombie genre changed. The Haitian lore was left behind, replaced with a new lore that was inspired by the spread of disease, by societal breakdown, and by genre works from the likes of Richard Matheson and John Wyndham. The Serpent and the Rainbow attempts to undo this, with Wes Craven doing for Haiti what he'd done for America, which was to expose the corruption behind the facade. The Serpent and the Rainbow doesn't only focus on the classic master-controlling zombie narrative, but also on the fraught recent political history of the island nation. Haiti had, from 1957 to 1986, suffered the cruelty of the Duvalier dictatorship. First under François Duvalier from 1957 to his death in 1971, and then under his son Jean-Claude Duvalier, nicknamed Baby Doc. Baby Doc Duvalier was deposed only 2 years before The Serpent and the Rainbow was released. The film bears the scars of that dictatorship, itself a form of master-slave relationship, where the political elite control the will and actions of the people. The story follows Bill Pullman, an American anthropologist who is dragged into a zombie narrative while searching for a super anesthetic on behalf of an American corporation. Thus, the dark side of American culture is again pulled to the forefront, given that American interference in its neighbors' politics has been, well, let's just say the CIA and American corporations don't have many friends south of the border. The Serpent and the Rainbow is a nightmare journey into control and repression, but it ends on a hopeful note with the fall of the Duvalier regime. But while the Duvalier dictatorship is a thematic villain, the physical villain of the story is also interesting. if we can call him fully physical. Like Freddy Krueger before him, Darshant Petro is a villain of dreams. He might be a living man of flesh and blood, but he operates in a state of nightmares, one that takes us beyond the real world.
You dreamt of me and of the grave. I know because I was there.
It seems we can broadly divide Craven's horror cinema into 3 brackets. 1. The brutal, crude horror films about the family unit being torn apart, like in The Last House on the Left and The Hills Have Eyes. 2. Films about people haunted by their nightmares, or at least nightmarish specters that force characters to face either their inner demons or external pressures. This includes, obviously, A Nightmare on Elm Street, and less obviously, The Serpent and the Rainbow. And 3, metatextual, more experimental films that play with narrative, like New Nightmare and the Scream franchise. More on those later.
Damn little shits. What'd you call me? Huh? Not your friend.
Let's look at a film that belongs in both the second group and the third group, where a dream monster intrudes on reality while toying with genre conventions. We're talking about Shocker, which was Wes Craven's next film following The Haitian Nightmare. The movie is an oddball, and it is rarely mentioned when we speak of Craven's career. Neither I nor Mr. Craven mentioned it during our conversation, though to be fair, I hadn't yet seen it at the time. But I have seen it now, and for all its weirdness, for its many stops and starts, for all its flaws, I still think Shocker is a worthy film. When serial killer Horace Pinker is executed, he turns into an electrical ghost with the ability to possess his victims, and he enters lead character Jonathan Parker's nightmares.
You got it, asshole.
Horace Pinker is a sort of relative to Freddy Krueger. Both are serial killers, both are a bit offbeat, both are sadistic, and both can enter the dreams of others. Though Freddy is a much more pure monster, Horace seems a bit of a thematic mess. He is all over the place, possessing people, entering dreams, moving like electricity, and doing a deal with the devil. Yet the film remains fun. It's the kind of failure, if you want to use that word, that only a great filmmaker can create. And it actually captures a sense of the 1980s, feeling very much like a product of its era. An era, I might add, that Wes Craven helped define.
During the last several minutes.
That's the way it is.
You get that?
The People Under the Stairs followed in 1991. I loved this movie as a kid, and I reminisced happily about it. Wes Craven was amused and told me a couple of anecdotes from filming, but try as I might, I can't remember the details, so I can't repeat them. But I can tell you this. The People Under the Stairs is a fun, more kid-friendly exploration of the themes of family breakdown, as well as a wry reaction to 80s politics. The film centers on a young boy, Poindexter Williams, nicknamed Fool. The boy named Fool is far from stupid. Rather, he is a product of decades of American capitalism, and as a young African American living in the ghetto, he's certainly been handed the fuzzy end of the lollipop. His family is facing eviction. Here again, we have the fractured American family theme. But The People Under the Stairs is a more hopeful kind of horror film, one where Fool, breaking into his evil landlord's house, discovers that the cruel Robesons are keeping young adults trapped, you guessed it, under the stairs. Said young adults have turned to cannibalism for survival, but unlike their Hills Have Eyes compatriots, these cannibals are not truly corrupted. The People Under the Stairs ends on a hopeful note.
Fool, you okay?
With Fool achieving a warped version of the American dream.
I feel like $1 million.
The decade following The People Under the Stairs saw Wes Craven exploring a new, different theme. One he'd already briefly dipped his toe into, metatextualism, meaning storytelling that is self-referential, winking at the audience at each and every twist in the plot.
There are certain rules that one must abide by in order to successfully survive a horror movie.
Every horror film he made during this 10-year period plays with what horror can be and should be, toying with the formula, cheekily sending up the genre. The most famous metatextual Craven film is, of course, Scream, a wildly successful 1996 slasher that led to an ongoing, still popular franchise. Scream is perhaps Craven's second most well-known picture after A Nightmare on Elm Street. The franchise, created by screenwriter Kevin Williamson, plays heavily on horror tropes, both confirming and subverting them. The rules are laid out, and then Craven and company get to have fun. But Wes Craven had actually dipped his toes into metatextual storytelling prior to the Scream franchise. Wes Craven's New Nightmare was, as Craven has admitted in interviews, an attempt to steer the Elm Street ship back towards what he thought the franchise should be. The prior Elm Street films had become their own thing, with the series becoming increasingly kitschy and comedic. Not that this necessarily is a bad thing, but it wasn't what Craven had intended. In New Nightmare, Wes Craven plays himself, and so do franchise stars Robert Englund and Heather Langenkamp. The resulting film is too inside baseball for most viewers, but for fans of the filmmaker, it is an absolute treat. In a sense, a filmmaker lovingly parodying his own greatest hit. Craven also tried to make a parody of the vampire genre with the Eddie Murphy vehicle A Vampire in Brooklyn. The film was a flop and is considered among the worst of both Craven and Murphy's careers, but it has since its release gained a cult following.
But next time.
Put a little heart into it.
A Vampire in Brooklyn, like Craven's other 90s movies, is staunchly metatextual, in this case playfully exploring vampire lore in a modern African-American context. Still, its lack of defenders at its time of release threatened to derail both Murphy and Craven's careers. Murphy, however, soon had a success with The Nutty Professor, and Craven had Scream. In fact, the Scream franchise was so successful that it thoroughly dominated the remaining years of Craven's career. While he made other films, including the Meryl Streep drama Music from the Heart and the airplane thriller Red Eye, Craven's biggest commercial and critical successes after Scream were Scream 2, Scream 3, and his final film, Scream 4. Don't get me wrong, they're all fun, yet they cannot compare with the genre-bending original, and personally, I preferred watching something new and original from the master of horror. He was so good at that, coming up with new horror worlds. Yet Craven's last two original horror films were both met with critical scorn and box office dismissal. Cursed was a troubled 2005 werewolf movie written by Scream collaborator Kevin Williamson. The film suffered reshoots and re-edits, yet however messy the final result was, I was entertained by both it and by a young Jesse Eisenberg's performance. My Soul to Take followed in 2010, and it was strange. Strange in the same way that Shocker was strange, with a similar type of thematic background. In this teen slasher, a serial killer named the Ripper dies. However, his soul remains, taking hold of one of the so-called Riverton Seven. But which one? Wes Craven was proud of the film, and defended it against the poor, sometimes downright cruel reviews. For me, the film doesn't quite work, but I'm on Craven's side here. Critics so often play it safe, especially when it comes to horror. They are willing to tear anything down that tries to do something offbeat, and they rarely recognize genre film brilliance upon its release. The Thing, Blade Runner, and many others can attest to this. I told Mr. Craven my preference for original works over sequels, and asked what he was working on next, hoping of course it was something new and different. I regret this question now. It was the only sour note in our conversation. With a sad smile, he told me that he had nothing going on at the moment. I answered that this was a shame. I wanted more Wes Craven films, preferably originals. Wes Craven agreed. A few months later, Wes Craven passed away from a brain tumor. How do I sum up a career as versatile and influential as Wes Craven's? When I make a video essay about a filmmaker, I try to pick one or two things from his or her career, a point of focus, if you will. With Wes Craven, I kept meaning to write an episode for 3 years, starting a draft and throwing it out after a few lines. I could never settle on what theme to focus on, how to sum him up, what specific angle of approach to take. Perhaps I lacked objectivity. I didn't know Wes Craven beyond our one single conversation, so I can't and I won't claim some sort of familiarity. I only had a brief glimpse into his life, and that glimpse was mostly focused on movies, not on personal stuff, save for a bit of kind moral support he offered me, a young screenwriter trying so hard to break into an impossible business. It was a wonderful meeting, one of my favorite experiences in the industry. Over the years I've met several famous filmmakers. Some, like Craven, were lovely. Guillermo del Toro was truly kind. Director Daniel Stamm of The Last Exorcism fame was supportive and enthusiastic. Editor-turned-director Patrick Lussier was touched when I said Craven had described him as the best editor he ever worked with. Other meetings have been more random. Over a period of 3 years, I kept running into Joe Dante, though I've never actually spoken to the man. Last time we met, he did a double take, as if he recognized me, and now I worry Mr. Dante thinks I'm a stalker. I swear I'm not. Actor Elliot Gould also did a double take at me, though to be fair, I nearly ran him over with my car. In my defense, though, he was jaywalking. There have been other meetings, random encounters, and even entire professional relationships, and some of those have been less than pleasant. Them, however, I will not waste anyone's time on. Suffice it to say that the otherwise brilliant actor James Woods once growled at me.
I don't know. Maybe it's something about my personality. What do you think? Hey! Up yours, asshole!
After more than a decade working in the industry, the meeting with Wes Craven still stands out. When I a few months later read his obituary, it put a new context to our entire conversation, to the love of cinema he spoke of, to the tenderness between him and his wife, and to his sense of melancholy, just there, buried underneath it all. It was a context that I couldn't see at the time, but that later became so very obvious. The funny thing is, as much as I fretted over this episode, in the end, I knew full well what I wanted to say about him. I wanted to talk about his movies, and how great they are. But more than that, I wanted to say this: Wes Craven was a good man, and I liked him. My name is Wolfcraft. This is History of Horror. If you liked the episode, I'd sure appreciate it if you liked, shared, and subscribed. Thanks aplenty.